Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be going over a really cool game from round 2 of the 2013 Candidates Tournament. White's going to be played by Levon, Aronian, and Black's going to be played by Boris, Gelfand. Now, those not too familiar, Boris actually won this tournament last year, so he has a ton of experience actually going deep in these tournaments and winning them. So keep that in mind as we play. But this, up until this point, has been the most exciting match, so I'm really excited to do some commentary and go over it. Both extremely talented players, but we'll go ahead and just jump into it. White starts with knight to f3, and then pawn c5, and then pawn here to c4. This is kind of the English opening. This is the symmetrical English opening with both sides kind of opting for this pawn to c4 and pawn to c5 there. Black responds with just knight to c6, pretty common. White's going to play knight to c3. Again, kind of that symmetrical English as we talked about. And then pawn to g6, has the ability to bring his bishop here to g7. Try to control these dark squares in the board. White also has the same, opportunity. He can play, pawn here to g3 and try to control the center with his bishop here. Kind of that modern opening as far as controlling the center with your minor pieces. Instead plays pawn here to e3, recognizing he can play now his pawn to d4, also opening up for his bishop to protect this pawn here on c4. So kind of some flexibility. Hasn't really said one way or the other if he's going to bring his bishop here to g2, fianchetto on the king side and castle. So still leaving himself a lot of different options as far as what Levon wants to do here. So Boris decides to play knight to f6, again getting his minor pieces involved. Usually you are going to want to develop your knights before bishops. That's kind of a saying, knights before bishops. So that's kind of what we have here, especially in this English opening, is the knights getting involved into the board. Then you have pawn here to d4, kind of striking the center of the board, saying, hey, I want to control specifically with my pawns. And then after the pawn takes and Levon recaptures, then Boris comes down and plays pawn to d5. Really doesn't want to have to deal with, pawn here to d5, chasing the knight away. This is kind of a pain. So really just this pawn to d5 is more of a, hey, I really just don't want to have to deal with this pawn moving forward, and less about, trying to counterattack the center of the board. But Levon's just going to go ahead and take with his pawn, and then after the knight comes, then the queen's going to come here to b3. And I was kind of excited to see this move because it is a fairly aggressive move from Levon. This is, he had a lot of different options as far as, if he could have got his bishop out, early on. But he got his queen out right away in b3. And so this is not only attacking this pawn here on b7, it's also attacking this knight here on d5. And indirectly, it's attacking the pawn here on f7, which is pretty exciting as far as, this English opening. You don't see this all that often. So after the knight takes here, White has a few options. He can always take with his pawn right here. He can always take with his queen. Probably wouldn't be as advised because it's no longer as active as it used to be. So, if he had the choice, he would just go ahead and take it with his pawn. But played a nice little in-between move and played this bishop here to c4. Basically saying, hey, Black's got to defend this square on f7, which early on is a weakness for Black because the only piece that's really defending it is the king. And so right now it's kind of, getting a bishop involved into the game, the center of the board, really controlling the center with his light square bishop. And since he has his queen behind, he knows, okay, next move I can take with my pawn if I want to, but now I have this bishop that's kind of buying me an extra move, and I'm really winning that development standpoint. So from here, Black decides, he could have played something like pawn to e6 if he wanted to. Instead he plays knight here to d5, which makes sense. Wants to go ahead and bring his knight back, and he is okay with this position right here. So he, Black definitely had options, and this is kind of what he chose. From here, the pawn's just going to come to e6, kind of forcing that bishop to go somewhere. And the bishop decides to just go ahead and recapture. So after recapture, this is kind of where we're at, and this is what I want to talk about a little bit as far as what both sides are looking to do. So if we look at it first from Black's perspective, what are the things he's looking at? Okay, he doesn't have any of his pieces developed, so he's definitely behind in the development game. He definitely needs to make sure that his king is safe, so he's probably going to be looking to get his dark square bishop involved into the game, castle on the king side. Obviously his queen side is, completely messed up as far as, any structural to, keep his king safe. He also wants to get his light square bishop involved into the game. Usually d7 is kind of more of a passive move. It's really not doing anything. So look for a move like b7 or b6 or a6, excuse me. Somewhat of an aggressive move to get that involved. Definitely wants to get both of his rooks involved. Right now they're not doing anything. So again, it's not how many pieces you have, but how active they are. So also wants to get his queen involved into the game. He can always play a move like queen to d5. This is a nice little outpost for any of his pieces. Because white doesn't have a light square bishop, it's going to be a little harder for him to kind of put pressure on any piece right here. So the queen can obviously come down right away, put pressure on here. Even if the queen exchanges here on d5, he does have protection here. So that's going to be completely fine. Also, we have some semi-open files. So there's a semi-open file here on the E file, on the C file. So look for rooks to come there. They're obviously going to be a lot better on open files or semi-open files just because they have a lot more room to go around. So kind of as we move forward in the game, we've kind of gone past the opening for the English. There's a lot of different variations, but this is one of the main book lines. And now we get into the middle game, so it's always kind of good to think about, okay, what are both sides really trying to do and what are they trying to accomplish, because you always want to have a plan going into the middle game. White now plays castling on the king side. Again, want to get that king side safety. And black plays bishop here to e7. Now, he had the choice. He could have played bishop here to g7. I don't necessarily know that would have been a horrible move. But again, he wants to make sure that he can castle on the king side. White's going to play bishop to e3, and this is completed development for white. So he has now connected his rooks, so he can now start to get those developed into the game. All of his pieces are developed. He's definitely winning the development game compared to black. So black has some moves he definitely needs to make. He goes and plays queen to d5, getting his queen involved into the game. Next, he'll definitely want to get his light square bishop, castle, usually on the king side, and start to try to have some sort of counterattack or kind of hold on, depending if he wants to play for a draw. He can always play, somewhat defensive. Now the rook's going to come over to c1, kind of controlling this, semi-open file. And then black decides to go ahead and take here on b3, which makes sense. After the pawn takes here on b3, white has doubled pawns. But if we kind of look at it, black has some weaknesses as well. Again, here on the b file, double pawns are definitely a weakness. But black has an isolated pawn here on c6, and he also has a backwards pawn here on a7. So black has, a few things that white can really zone in on and start to attack. White also is controlling, for both the backwards pawn and the isolated pawn, he has rooks on those semi-open files. So he's going to be able to apply a ton of pressure. He can also, play knight here to e5, putting pressure on this pawn on c6. So both sides have weakness, but both sides really know exactly what they need to do to put pressure on the other side. Black responds with bishop here to b7. Again, he needs to make sure that he develops all of his pieces, and he also wants to protect this pawn here on c6. After the rook came over to c1, attacking this pawn has to have a defender there, or he's just going to lose it. Now white plays knight to e5, again trying to overload this pawn here on c6. Right now there's two attackers and there's only one defenders. And then black plays king castle. Now in this game, when I was watching it, I assumed Levon was going to snap, take this pawn on c6, and then high-five one of his neighbors. But instead he didn't, and it took me a few moves to figure out what he was going to do, because again, this pawn's just kind of hanging out there. Even if he takes and the bishop recaptures, the rook is going to take here on c6. Now, obviously black can come over, he can swing, bring his rook over to b8, put pressure on this pawn on b3. He'll definitely have to play somewhat defensive if he wants to kind of hold on to this. But still, he's up in material. I thought for sure he would do this. Instead, in the actual game, he played rook over here to a4. And so kind of looked like one of those things where he was going to play rook over to c4 potentially and put more pressure on there if he just wanted more pressure. But it was kind of I don't really understand why he's not playing this, because everyone kind of looked at it and said, okay, this is good. This is not a bad move for white at all. Why not just capture this piece or the pawn there on c6? But black went ahead and responded with rook over to d8, starting to put pressure on his own square on d4, kind of a counterattack, if you will. And then white played knight over here to c4. Again, I still thought Levon was going to play knight takes here on c6, but he decided not to. And because this knight took, Gelfand kind of saw an opportunity and played bishop here to f6. Now he's putting extra pressure on this pawn on d4. He is now overloaded. He now has a rook here on d8 and a bishop here on f6. And it was kind of okay, is he now putting more pressure on Levon. What's Levon going to do? And then Levon played a nice little move, and he played knight here to a5. And then it kind of all started to make sense as far as what he wanted to do. He didn't want to go ahead and take here on c6. Instead, he wanted to rearrange his knight over here on a5 and put a lot of pressure on there. So now he's not only pressuring, the bishop here on b7, but now he's also putting pressure on, the pawn on c6. So again, all the pressure before, and he's also now, double protected with his rook here on a4 and the bishop here on e3. So if you kind of look at this, it now makes sense. He's actually in a better position than he was. He's still putting the same pressure, than before. It's not going to make sense now. The rook can't come over because he still has to, worry about this bishop here on b7. Black responds with rook to d7. Again, he wants to protect this bishop on b7, and this bishop doesn't want to move right away because it's protecting, the pawn here on c6. And white responded with a really good move, and he played rook to b4. Again, trying to overload all of his pieces, trying to put black in a really tough spot. Now, he wants to be careful because I was looking, I was like, well, okay, he could always try for, knight here to c6. Again, this looks somewhat overloaded. But then, as I looked more about it and some other people were doing some commentary, I saw the move rook here to c8. And this is a really tough move for, Levon to really deal with because, you could see, the rook swing over to c4 now. And then after, let's say, the rook takes, and then the rook could recapture, and then we could have, the bishop takes, and then the rook takes, and then we could have the bishop coming down here to d4. And this is going to be somewhat of a problem because now black is even in material, but he doesn't have doubled pawns right here. So white's kind of taken the initiative and the advantage that he has and kind of thrown it away because white really has to recapture now because he doesn't want to lose this pawn right here, and he doesn't want to play, super passive with a move like bishop here to c1. So this is definitely going to be good for black. So in the game, obviously he didn't take, and instead he just moved his rook over here to b4, which again was definitely better. Here, if we come back here, the rook came over here to b4. So definitely a better move for white. And then black played bishop here to a6. Again, wants to make sure that this overloaded bishop here on b7 is protected. And then white now took on c6. So again, I thought he was going to take many moves before, and I don't still think it was going to be a terrible move if he did, but this is a much better position for white. And he's just in a much more dominant position. Again, this rook is much more active than it was here, let's say on a1. It was kind of, this semi-open file. But now it's completely dominating right here. White's also threatening knight here to b8, which is a really horrible move that black would have to deal with. It just has so many threats right here. And it's also protected by this rook. And this rook on a8 is not doing a whole heck of a lot. He really needs, Boris really needs to get this piece involved into the game, but this knight is just causing so much havoc for black. This is a really good position for white. Black now responds with the rook over to b7. Again, he has to kind of stop this knight coming here to b8. And then white plays pawn to h3, kind of allowing himself some breathing room if he ever needs to move his king away. And then the king's also going to come here to g7, making sure that their kings, can't be attacked later on by rooks. They just don't want to have to deal with it at all. And so knight now takes on, the rook now takes on b7, and then after the bishop recaptures, then the knight swings over here to e4. And this does two things. One, it kind of blocks off this bishop from attacking the pawn here on d4, but it also kind of opens up the door for, this rook to get involved into the game. So, the rook on the second rank or the seventh rank are very strong. So, white's looking to bring his rook here to c7 and really rain havoc. Obviously, he would want to swing it over to f7 if he could because it's protected by the knight, but also putting pressure on the bishop on b7. Black really has to respond to that, so he plays bishop here to d8. The good thing about this is if you're forcing your opponents to defend with their major and minor pieces, that's awesome because this bishop here on d8 is not active at all. It's not controlling the center of the board. All it's doing is controlling this c7 square, and it's also blocking off the rook here on a8, which is not really what black wants to be doing right now. White now responds with pawn to b4, again starting to push those pawns forward and put more pressure on black. And then rook comes over to c8. Now in the game, this was kind of the deciding factor, because what Boris Gelfand didn't recognize is that across from him was going to be just a complete animal that had one of the best moves we've seen in the tournament so far. Definitely in this game, it was kind of the turning point. And it makes sense, trying to alleviate some of this pressure here. He doesn't want to have to deal with this rook coming here to c7, kind of blocking off this bishop from doing anything. So yeah, it makes sense. If the trade here on c8, then the bishop can come here to c8, and then it's kind of a okay 2-bishop pair versus a knight and a bishop. This is going to be completely fine. Unfortunately for black, he did not see the move bishop here to h6, and this is just a devastating move. If the king does take here on h6, then the rook can now come, and then if the bishop takes, then the knight can come here to f7 and fork this bishop here on d8. So if king to g7, then the knight takes here on d8, and this is just going to be very, very bad for black. Not only is he down in material, but white can just immediately put all of his pawns on dark squares. This light square bishop no longer means anything, and then this knight can just go around gobbling up pawns, and white can centralize and have a very easy game from there. So great move that he actually saw this. Now in the game, black decided not to go down this path. Instead, he played king here to g8, which makes sense. He doesn't want to capture and then just be in complete world of hurt. But unfortunately for him, his king just really can't move a lot now. It's kind of blocked off with this bishop here on h6, and so while white can definitely get his king centralized and put a lot of pressure on black, black really can't do much with his king. So if we kind of go back just a minute and say, okay, well, rook to c8 was definitely not the best move. So what could have black done as far as trying to equalize it? And he did have a decent move, and so he could have played bishop here to d5. And so always looking for these nice outposts for your minor pieces. The knight here on e5 is nicely placed because it's defended by this pawn here on d4. Black had the same thing. He was worried about his bishop being attacked on b7, so he could have easily brought his bishop here to d5 and had a nice little outpost. Again, white still has a small advantage, but it's not real clear how he's going to take advantage of that, especially now with black kind of controlling the center of the board. But again, into the game, the rook came over here to c8, and then after the bishop, then the king comes back to g8. Now, white now decided to go ahead and recapture, or capture here on c8, and then after the bishop took, then the knight's going to come over here to c6. Again, just putting so much pressure on black. He's now threatening both this bishop here on d8. He's also threatening the pawn here on a7. Black has to be careful. He can't play a move like bishop here to b6, which somewhat makes sense. He's now protecting both of them because now the knight can just come over here to e7 and fork the bishop here on c8. So can't do that. Instead, decides to go ahead and play a bishop here to f6, saying, okay, if you're going to take my pawn on a7, that's not the worst thing ever. I'm going to recapture here on d4 and put pressure on you. So again, definitely one of the better moves. And so pawn just now starts to push forward to b5. Again, anytime you kind of have this lead in space right here, you want to kind of push it down your opponent's throat. And so pawn to b5, pushing those pawns. And now bishop here to d7. Again, attacking the knight here, trying to have some sort of pressure. Back here on c8, it's not doing a whole heck of a lot. And now the pawn's coming forward to g4. Now black has a few options in the game. He played pawn here to g5, which again makes some sense, kind of blocking off what this bishop can really do. He also could have tried something like pawn here to a6, which makes sense. Now the pawn can push forward, but then after the pawn takes, we're kind of look at it and say, okay, what's going to happen? This knight no longer has a protector. This bishop no longer has a protector. White's definitely still up. But again, there's really no great move for black now. He played this pawn to g5, which it's okay. It's not great. White responds with pawn to h4, saying, okay, I don't mind. You can go ahead and take that because I'm just going to push forward and block off the only defender that you have from this pawn. And again, I'm just protecting it with my bishop, so you can't really take it with yours. And so after the bishop takes here on c5 and the pawn recaptures, then white now has a passed pawn, which is really going to be difficult for black to deal with, considering now white can get his king involved into the game. So after the bishop comes back here to d8, Now the king starts to get involved into the game. Black really, he can't do much with his bishop like he wants to because he has to worry about this pawn coming forward. And so the bishop comes here to c7. Unfortunately for him, he kind of has to stay there. And so after the king comes to h3, Black was forced to resign. There was just no way to stop the force. He can't get his king involved to the game, as we talked about. And this king is just going to be able to go around the board and gobble up pieces and come over here and start to attack this bishop. And there's no way for Black to really hold on. So definitely an exciting game for round 2. After round 1, I was kind of curious, after all the matches tied, if we were going to just have what I would consider boring chess, where players really try to go for a draw. But Levon came out, and from the very beginning, you could tell that he was going for a win here. He wanted to make sure that he was going to take the lead after day 2. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Definitely more exciting on day 2 here for one of the top-rated players in the world. Definitely make sure that you check out the website. We're going to have more commentary from some of the other matches. But hopefully y'all enjoyed, and I'll see y'all in the next video. Thanks for watching.